boxes.
How's your instincts?
Oh, the one final thing, the class, the feedback, please do, that's online, electronic stuff, do by all means give me your sense of how the course went, what you thought of it, etc. That would be great. So we're going to look at Matryona's home. It's the second part. We dealt with the general themes and outlines, and we talked a bit about Solzhenitsyn as a Soviet dissident, and how the place that he goes to and ends up in, and what's the name of the place again, John? It's this quite funny home. Torfoprodukt. Torfoprodukt. It's right there in the second page. On the station building at Torfoprodukt, which is a hilarious name, because it is a product, and it's a certain type of product. It's a place where the train has stopped working. So because of that, it represents a place that is, and this is why he's happy to be there, he's outside the control of the Soviet bureaucracy. So it's a place where Mother Russia can be found. And Mother Russia exists beneath the substructure or the superstructure of the Soviet state. And that's where he wants to go. Not in the beyond the Urals where it's hot and the country is very different, but in deep Mother Russia. So he's going there. And it doesn't work, and that's interesting. Why does this station not work? It's because of a train accident. And so there's all sorts of commentary on the growth of the state, and it's implicit here, but it becomes explicit elsewhere, that wherever the bureaucracy is, things don't work. And the reason that the bureaucracy is to for the sake of efficiency, right? That's what the state is supposed to do. It's supposed to centralize and make things more efficient, and it does the exact opposite. And so he catalogs that, but one of the things that he is most interested in, and I think this is what he is best at, Solzhenitsyn as a writer, is he does very keen analysis of characters, and in particular their corruption. But in the case of Matryona, the exact opposite. So it is a lot like Tolstoy's novella, in the sense that all of the characters seem to be marked by the same sort of superficial, self-centered, do it for yourself, living while working within the system, not really pushing against it, going along with life, but being concerned only about temporary material matters. And the additional irony that lies between Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn is the Soviet state is there precisely to make sure that those material needs are dealt with. That's the point of bringing it in. It's to bring a sort of equality and make sure that everyone is materially provided for, that the workers own the means of production. So that everything's state-owned, all are state agencies. There's no private property. The private property has been abolished. Private wealth. Everything's state-run. Imagine the CBC in every realm. That's what it would be like. So it has its apparent advantages, and then it has its clear disadvantages. The disadvantages are obvious here. And the effect is one of dehumanization, but it happens not only on the general level, but very specifically. He says that under this regime, individuals have no freedom, firstly, and secondly, they become corrupted in their own conduct. And they become corrupted in their own conduct because the rule of law, the rule of the state is one that they acknowledge but work against subtly. So they have to lie and cheat and steal all the time just in order to survive. So they're leading a double life. So it forces everybody to become fraudulent. The bigger the state, and so for me, this is an interesting novella, and we're concluding with this, because I think that Solzhenitsyn's novella here, it becomes symptomatic of the state of modernity. As the state grows, human virtue declines. Yes?
When you say modernity, do you mean like a modern era?
I do. Modern era in the sense of the 20th century now, even. But we saw it all the way back into the 18th century, with Jonathan Swift talking about it in A Modest Proposal. Right? I mean, Pope in his mock epic was talking about how the mannerisms and so forth are trite and superficial, but that, I mean, that's gentle, teasing satire. When it comes to Pope, it's pretty sharp and biting, and talking about the dehumanization that's taking place in the name of efficiency, and in the name of the British Crown and the Irish problem, and what's happening as a result of not only the dehumanization of the Irish, but literally eating them out of house and home. And so he suggests, why not just go the whole hog and let's eat the babies, and then we can make a profit on it, because they'll fatten them up and sell them off, and we'll get good food, and then everybody's happy, right? What's the objection? It's meant to be so jarring. The moral atrocity is meant to jar people into think, well, what are we already doing? And then we got the exact same thing in Heart of Darkness, the dehumanization that happens in the name of pursuing efficiency. Right? Same sort of thing. The Romantics also talk about what we heard our speaker, Malcolm Dwight, talk about in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, this instrumentalization of nature, to see it as just a thing to be used. And that will eventually include human nature, and it already does here, but it will become explicitly so in novels which you probably read in high school, like Brave New World, or in 1984, where human beings then become the things that are colonized or experimented upon, and the means is to gain power over that nature, to benefit human nature, which ends up being a macabre situation, where people are being given all sorts of drugs and solutions to their problems that are actually causing problems that were never even imagined in the past. So this is it. I'm talking now about the broad theme throughout the semester. I think there is that theme there. So there's an alienation going on in human nature. Alienation from what true humanity is, which for Milton is Jesus Christ. Right? He's the true human being. Adam and Eve lost their true humanity when they disobeyed and rebelled against God. And then the Enlightenment sought to rectify the problems of the fall, but through the pursuit of reason. But the pursuit of reason led to a further dehumanization. It just had a particular character, followed the scientific method, reduced human beings to statistics, which just accelerates over the course of time. So now that technology is taking the place of human relationships, social media, and so forth. So it's a literary critique of a genuine human situation that never existed in the past. So this is the problem of science, or of modern science. So this instrumentalization of nature, and with it is lost the sense of the sacred, the transcendent, the metaphysical, the theological, God. That goes with it. And it ends up in the 20th century in the Gulag and in the prison camp, like Auschwitz and Birkenau and so forth. But the narrator is writing in 1953, after Stalin is done, after he's just come out of prison camp, the Gulag, and is now finding his way back to a place that is outside the grip of the state, and is trying to find his identity as a man, having gone through the horrors of the Second World War and through the Gulag. He's seeking something, going back to Russian origins. And then he ends up in Matryona's home. Remember, Matryona is the Russian word for mother here. He's going to Mama's house. Going back to Mama. It's not his Mama, but she represents something Russian and good and virtuous and real. And that doesn't mean that it's not a, the portrait is not utopian. Her house is not portrayed as this beautiful place. It's a ramshackle, rundown, cat-ridden. In the walls there are these terrible bugs. You know, just like your skin's crawling. Yes?
What are these plastic plants that keep popping up in your house, and they keep mentioning them at the end?
Yeah. Well, they're not plastic, are they? They're real plants. Are they, or are they not rubber plants?
Or rubber. Rubber plastic is another kind of plastic.
It is, but I'm assuming they're not real rubber. I think they're real plants, aren't they?
It's a type of plant?
A type of rubber plant, yeah. That's what I understood. I didn't understand them as an artificial. Sorry?
The plant that rubber would be...
It could literally be a rubber plant where you get rubber from. That is what you get rubber from, a rubber plant.
Yeah.
But I assume that that's not what's meant here, but it could be. I just think they're big, overglowing plants. It's like a Garden of Eden within the...
Okay. Because at first I was thinking, like, why does she have these plastic plants that just seem to line up with the rest of it?
Yeah, but they also keep growing and they're everywhere, and she looks after them. I don't think you look after plastic plants.
That's what I thought, like, is she crazy?
No. Well, she is a little bit crazy.
Yes.
There's, in one sense, but I think that they are plants and they are alive, and she's looking after them and they're flourishing. Within the house, outside the house, not so much. So again, you can see the home environment where everything, all creatures seem to be blessed. So if you want to see her as a sort of an ancient mariner, she's blessing the creepy crawlies in her house, which include the cats and the cockroaches, which come out, and yeah, I know, when the lights go out and you go in, there's all these, oh yeah, I know, it's like, so it's a decrepit place, but there seems to be an acceptance and an embrace of them in a way which is quite, again, it's not utopian. This is not a beautiful house by any means. Yes?
So when you reference the ancient mariner, are you referencing who blesses
The sea creatures unaware. Yeah, at first you see them creepy crawly things and slimy beasts, sea snakes, elven, and at first he's repelled by them. And later on, when he can't pray, remember? Mm-hmm. At first, they're not from him, and yet, after he fails in his own attempts at prayer, he blesses them unaware. But it's not someone that does. He blesses them unaware. So it's like the Spirit of God. Guy talked about that transformation where it seems to come from outside of the mariner, and it allows him to pray. So it's like a freshening wind that allows the transformation of the mariner, which he emphasized was akin to a conversion of sorts, which I think it is in the narrative. Goes into a hellish landscape, drops down below the earth, as it were, and then comes back up. I think this place, it's not the same narrative framework, but the home itself represents this sacred place. And the sanctity is being taken apart, and this is part of the portrait of the predations of the state, is everybody, in order to get things good, they're just stealing, robbing, grabbing whatever they can. In this case, the relatives are literally picking boards off the side of the house before she's dead. It's like the prodigal son demanding his inheritance before the father's dead. Like, give me my third right now. And he gives it to him. So if that analogy holds, which I think it does to some extent, then Matryona is the God figure in it. I mean, I don't want to overstate that, but she people that demand things from her, she just gives it to them. Everybody else regards her as naive, contemptible, ridiculous, and he does as well, the narrator, until the very end, and he realizes what an important figure she was, and in fact he associates her and her actions and her state with the only thing that's preventing God's judgment on the Soviet Union, right? Because it explicitly refers to, see Genesis 18:23 to 33, the story of Sodom. Yeah.
So, what about when Matryona refuses people to pay her? Like, sometimes it seems like she's this virtuous person, like, oh, just giving, but at the same time, they're trying to help her, and she's like refusing that help.
Yeah.
So it's not always.
And why is never explained.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't say she regarded it as her Christian duty to do that or something. She just, and she doesn't. So the rationale for that is never made plain. She just, this is how she acts, and she almost does. The reason it's not discussed is perhaps there's no thought that goes into it. Maybe because she is the true Russian, just like the Soviet Union wants. This is a selfless individual who regards everything to be in common, like we're told in Acts, where they divided everything equally and so forth in Jerusalem for a time, right? In the book of Acts, they shared their property. I mean,
she's a good communist?
She's a good communist in some ways. And this is the irony. She is a sort of a good communist. I don't think the book of Acts there is, by the way, a model for the church. That's the church in Jerusalem, which probably took Jesus' statement literally that the city was going to be destroyed, that Jerusalem would be flattened and that the temple itself would be destroyed, which it then was. But they gave away all their property. They took him literally when he was not talking about the literal destruction of Jerusalem. You would sell your property if you thought the property was about to become worth nothing because it was going to be destroyed, like Sodom and Gomorrah. Yes?
So why would she be a good communist if she's also an anti-communist?
Well, she's not an anti-communist figure. She goes along with things. She acts like you are supposed to act in the communist regime. It's selfless. You do everything, it's the common good. Everything's for the common good. There's nothing self-centered about her. That's what all communists are supposed to be like. She's the only one that does it. She does it willingly. They want to impose it from above. Those that want to impose it from above fail spectacularly in bringing it about, and we find on the individual level that if everyone's given everything equally without reward, without merit, without any work, that most people are going to then do nothing and do it out of selfishness. Like if I gave everybody in this class the same grade, you'd all be very happy if I gave you an A. At least you think you would. But if you've been working really hard the whole semester, you might turn around and say, hold on, that person never showed up and handed in no work, and you're giving that person an A as well, and you might be annoyed about that. That would have no effect on the class. But in year 2, how much work would you do in year 2 at that point? What would be the effect on the best students and their habits, and apply that to the workplace? That's what happens in the Soviet Union. You get the same wage no matter how much you do. You can't be dismissed. It's a totally secure environment. Everyone is equal treatment across the board. Well, what's the effect of that is most people where there's no reward for work, they don't work as hard. And they feel like everybody's cheating, which they all are. Everybody cheats then. Because whether you act rightly or whether you act badly, there's the same reward. So what are you going to do? You're going to regard everybody else as being a cheater. So what are you going to do? Are you going to cheat? And the answer is they all cheat, but she does not. So she is the communist ideal, and she's Solzhenitsyn his ideal as well. So that's really interesting. So the Soviet dissident who fights with the Red Army against the Nazis really does, he's a true believer in one sense. He just thinks that the Soviet Union was not the means to get there. But the conduct, the ideal seems correct in some ways. And very Russian. That's how he portrays it at any rate, it seems to me. Yeah.
At some point, doesn't she steal Pete as well, and just doesn't use much of it?
Does she steal it?
Doesn't she?
All the women
At
steal
one,
it.
yeah,
All the women
steal
do,
it,
but
and
she
then
doesn't, does she?
She goes out, and then he's like, because he gets Pete for her, but it's just like something about, what did she say?
She wants to get around.
Yeah,
It's
something like
honest.
that.
Because it's not honest.
But it's not honest to go take it either, but she's doing it.
Yeah.
I
And
see.
she hides it somewhere so people won't find it. She was talking about how sometimes they raid her house.
They allocate it, don't they? I mean, there's a certain amount that you can have, but you can't have more than that. But the amount that you can have isn't enough to heat your house, which is why everybody's going and getting more.
And she's not working, so she doesn't get any allocated.
She gets none allocated as a result.
So she goes and steals it. And
Right.
hides it.
You're
And
right.
She sees that as her work, and she won't take his.
Right. So it's got to be honest stealing, not. Yeah. So I don't think it. I don't think so. Matryona, and I said this the first class. There's part of her which seems like a Christ figure or a God figure, except that it isn't, and she isn't, because she's not presented without her faults. She clearly has her faults, and the author is not sparing in his description of that. But nonetheless, she's the heroine. Of that, there's no doubt. So she's not. Again, this is a realistic novel. It's not meant to portray. This is not hagiography. She's a sort of a saint that he's describing. He's describing a realistically commendable individual, the sort of person he probably met, the salt of the earth type women, who was a little bit corrupt, but had her own moral compass and would not deviate from it. Yeah, and and then there's the cats, the gammy-legged cat, and the cockroaches, which are the cats want to eat, and if they catch a cockroach on there, then it makes the cat sick. And that's sort of actually what happens. That's what, and it would be worse if it was a dog. A dog eats everything, and dogs get sick as well. But it's interesting. There are all these strays in the house, and he's one of them. So he's one of the, alongside the rubber plants and the cockroaches and the gammy-legged cat, there's this guy who went to the war, was then put into the gulag, and is now gone to the one place he can in Soviet Russia where the state has not come, and he is like one of these damaged creatures living in the house. And she adopts him more or less in that sense. And he promises to pay her, and he does pay her, but not much. And she's satisfied with that. And doesn't even seem to care about the money in the end. So she's as I say, it's the sort of the Soviet ideal, and at the same time, and this is part of the ironic portrait, she is the ideal for the Soviets, and yet the Soviet system has put her in her early grave. Everyone operating under it. So he's almost saying something about, can a virtuous person survive in this culture? And the answer is no, it cannot. So it's a savage indictment. There's a bitter irony in the portrait, in the same way that we saw earlier that Swift was a satirist, Solzhenitsyn likewise. And there are some commonalities there as well. And I think, again, that was also true of Joseph Conrad. There's a bitter satire going on about his own culture, and the good and the great in particular. So those who are doing well and thriving in this culture they get particularly unsparing treatment. She gets potatoes out of her cellar. She picks the littlest for the goats, little ones for herself, egg-sized ones for me. So there's a priority here. The goat gets it the worst, then she, and then he. So at least she's got a sense of proportion there, but she's treating her guests better than she herself eats. It's interesting. Hospitality, saying something about the home. That is a theme, again, throughout the course. If you want to go back to last semester, look at the Odyssey and how important hospitality is. And how important hospitality is in conjunction with a civilization. So in the Greek conception of it, the city-state is the polis. From which we get the word political, but also polite. To be polite is to act in accordance with the manners of the polis. That gives way in the Roman Republic to the civitas. From which we get civilized as well, and civilization. And that's again the city, but now it's the city-state, the res publica, of the civitas. I think Augustine's work on the city of God, De Civitate Dei. So we get polite here, we get civilized here, and then when you come into the medieval period, rather than the city, it becomes a miniature city in the form of the court, from which we get courtesy. How does one conduct oneself in the court with courtesy? What are the manners expected? What does that look like? By this point, it's become Christianized. We have knights, Sir Gawain, the Green Knight, and so forth. But this is the behavior and the conduct, the moral conduct, and the treatment of others that one expects of a civilization. As we come to the scientific era, we find that this sense of being polite or civilized or courteous towards strangers and even within the house, how does that transform in the scientific era? We've seen the whole semester that there's a degradation of that. So part of it, go back to Rape of the Lock, it's a very polite society. Like they're drinking tea, they're getting up at noon, they spend their days getting dressed up in great costumes and going into great houses and playing cards in a very civilized fashion with lords and ladies and bells and bows. And this is the sum and substance of their day, and so it's a very, on the one level, very courteous conduct. And this is when etiquette manuals are appearing for the first time in the 18th century. As mass society develops and things become more and more rationalized, etiquette manuals appear for the first time. What are they for? They're for people who don't know how to behave in public and are yet out in public. Who are those people? The middle classes. Because the aristocrats have always understood these things, but now the aristocracy and those with wealth have expanded to include the upwardly mobile mercantile tradesmen who now have money, more money than maybe the aristocrats do. And so now they're out in high society, but they don't know how to act. So they come out with these etiquette manuals, which are highly interesting just as a phenomenon. They don't exist before that, now they do. So if you want to be socially acceptable in this particular context, how does one behave? Well, you drink your tea, you tip your, little pinky goes up or something, and drink your tea. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Here's where this fork goes, here's where this knife goes, the spoon here, etc. Like where are all the cutlery? How does a man treat a woman, an older woman, a younger woman? We saw that laid out already as a full-blown social conduct in the Odyssey. How does an older man treat a younger woman? How does a young woman treat an older man? How do you treat a stranger? And we saw that the model of the polis and the ideal conduct, even in the Odyssey, was actually the swineherd, who was on the lowest on the totem pole. Yet he was courteous, and he was also hospitable, and he gave of his substance to this man who he didn't know from Adam, who happened to be the lord of the manor, as it turned out. It was Odysseus, but he didn't know that. Right? And the same thing in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So these are consistent themes and marks of civility. Now, by this point, and we've seen various forms of critique of civilization. These are civilization critiques that are being mounted by some of the great writers in European languages about the manners of modern society. So Swift, first of all, with his savage satire, and Wordsworth talking about the dehumanization of nature and the Romantic movement in general, and then move on through Conrad, and then finally we come to Solzhenitsyn, and to some degree also with Tolstoy. Same sort of portrait being described here. Something is being lost of civilization, and a dehumanization results from it, and a coldness has set in, so that there's no love person to person. People are seen as mouths to feed and numbers. And even families are seen as unloving places. Go back to Tolstoy's novella, where a husband and wife, she's complaining how terribly he suffered. I could hear him from 3 doors away, 3 closed doors away. He suffered so terribly. I could barely stand it. And it's like, it's fantastic. What a wonderful description of her. Like, this is why these are well written. That just the way she puts it, we're aware of the character's attitudes that are asserting them. Actually, we see that she hates him, and yet she's dressing it up as care and concern. Well, that's what's happening throughout. So now there's a superficial courtesy, civilization, politeness, and underneath that there's a savage hostility towards one's fellow human beings, even living under the same house. And Matryona, on the other hand, represents something very different. She is even hospitable to the, quite frankly, disgusting cockroaches, and the gammy-leg cat, and this dissident who's now come under her roof, giving him the best of her fruit. Yes, thank you. Love goose after class. But back to the potatoes. There are no big ones because her garden was sandy and had not been manured since the war, since her husband was at home. So nobody's looked after her. She has a family. The kids are, where are the kids? They're all dead. Sorry? Well, I'm not sure about that. There's no indication of that, and hopefully not. But they've all died. So she's a pitiable figure. She's a widow, and without means to look after herself. She has no pension. She has no means. And yet she's not complaining, and rather than looking after herself, she's still acting like a mother, looking after others that just happen to fall under her influence. So I think that just as a conclusion to the whole course, it's quite fitting and helpful. When she serves him her breakfast and is given cooks her breakfast, there's no butter. That's not because she doesn't have any butter. The whole town doesn't have butter. It doesn't exist. We're talking about an area where cows ought to thrive, and you ought to be able to churn butter for yourself, but she's got this one goat which she's not going to keep for very long, and no means to produce it. It's terrible. Like this, compare that situation and go back to the Odyssey, where we have a swineherd and they're producing rich food right in front of them, even in their poverty. So all of that, when you start to compare and contrast the different states, we got modernity without civilization. There's a growing technological competence and a growing inhumanity. That doesn't mean she doesn't worry, so I'll just read a little extract here. Matryona had a lot of worries that winter. Her neighbors put it into her head to try and get a pension. She was all alone in the world, and when she began to be seriously ill, she had been dismissed from the kolkhozs as well. Injustices had piled up, one on top of another. She was ill, but was not regarded as a disabled person. She had worked for a quarter of a century in the kolkhoz. But it was a kolkhoz and not a factory. So she was not entitled to a pension for herself. So it was a pre-industrialized workhouse. But it wasn't industrialized, and Stalin wanted, for the sake of the furthering the war effort, for there to be factories to produce munitions and mechanical things to fight the Nazis. So these things simply didn't count, so she's got nothing. Again, it's the bureaucracy. She could only try and get one for her husband for the loss of her breadwinner. But she had no husband for 12 years now, not since the beginning of the war, and it wasn't easy to obtain all the particulars from different places about his length of service and how much he had earned. What a bother it was getting those forms, though. Getting somebody to certify that he'd earned, say, 300 rubles a month, that she lived alone and nobody helped her, what year she was born in. Then all this had to be taken to the pension office and taken somewhere else to get all the mistakes corrected and taken back again. Then you had to find out whether they would give you a pension. So it's going back here to here, here. You got to fill this in, and until you do that, I can't. We all recognize this is because this is now part of the Canadian experience in dealing with the government, right? You need this picture. Oh, that's not the right one. You need to go there. You go there. You get that done. They say, oh, yes, but that rule changed as of this date, and you were born. What year were you born? Okay, no, so you got to go back here. They're following the rules. They're not. There's not. So it's what Hannah Arendt describes as the banality of evil. There's an evil being done without an evil intent even. I mean, there's also evil intent. So there's personal corruption. She sees that all over the place. But this is just the banality of evil of a system that is there to serve people but actually ends up oppressing them in the name of progress, which is a consistent theme. To make it all more difficult, the pension office was 12 miles out east of Talnovo, the rural council office, 6 miles to the west. The factory district council an hour's walk to the north. So one's over here, one's up here, one's over here. They made her run around from office to office for 2 months on end to get an I dotted or a T crossed. Every trip took a day. She goes down to the rural district council, and the secretary isn't there today. Secretaries of rural councils aren't often here today. So come again tomorrow. Tomorrow the secretary is in, but he hasn't got his rubber stamp. So come again the next day. And the day after that, back she goes yet again because all her papers are pinned together and some cockeyed clerk has signed the wrong one. They shoved me around, Ignatius, she used to complain to me after these fruitless excursions. Worn out with it, I am. But she soon brightened up. I found that she had a sure means of putting herself in a good humor. She worked. She would grab a shovel and go off to pull potatoes, or she would tuck a sack under her arm and go after peat, or take a wicker basket and look for berries deep in the woods. When she'd been bending her back to bushes instead of office desks for a while, and her shoulders were aching from a heavy load, Matryona would come back cheerful, at peace with the world, and smiling her nice smile. I'm on to a good thing now, Ignatius. I know where to go for it. Peat, she meant. A lovely place it is. But surely my peat is enough, Matryona Vasilevna. There's a whole truckload of it. Pooh. Your peat, as much again, and then as much again. That might be enough. When the winter gets really stiff and the wind's battling at the window, it blows the heat out of the house faster than you can make the stove heat up. Last year we got heaps and heaps of it. I'd have had 3 loads in by now, but they're out to catch us. They've summoned one woman from our village already. That's how it was. The frightening breath of winter was already in the air. There were forests all around and no fuel to be had anywhere. Excavators roared away in the bogs, but there was no peat on sale to the villagers. So all of it, the villages, the countryside, the country is being pillaged for the purposes of the state, and the people that the state is supposed to serve, even those in the immediate area, have no means of living. So just as in the old days, they used to steal the squire's wood, now they would pinch peat from the trust. The women went off in parties of 5 or 10 so that they would be less frightened. They went in the daytime. The peat cut during the summer had been stacked up all over the place to dry. That's the good thing about peat. It can't be carted off as soon as it's cut. It lies around drying till autumn, or if the roads are bad, till the snow starts falling. This is when the women used to come and take it. They could get 6 peats in a sack if it was damp, or 10 if it was dry. So they go and they take it in order to survive. But of course they're stealing. They're stealing from the state which is preying off of them. So they're the modern day Robin Hoods, as it were. So what has changed? Well, the modern state is modern, but the feudal relationship has not changed. The people have not been improved. Yes?
How can Matryona be consistent with this character of doing everything right if she's still participating across the village in stealing?
Well, I mean, so you mean as Solzhenitsyn heroine, you mean? I just think he's being realistic here. That you would never meet a person that didn't do something.
But the thing is, she doesn't actually need to get this peat. She has a bunch of peat.
Right.
So why is it that he specifically made it so she would go with that? Like, there has to be some purpose here.
On his
Yes.
thinking, that's a good question. Why would he ask her to do that?
Because if she were really practical and just...
And she's not. So this is another thing about her. She doesn't seem very sensible. She's busy. She works hard. She's self-denying. She does do things for others. She puts them ahead of herself. But there's something that is infuriatingly impractical.
So is it just the work of the thing?
I think she just delights in the work. She just likes working. And actually that's very realistic. Work is enjoyable. Like working hard and like doing manual labor, you come out of it at the end of the day, you feel pretty good. Like you've done a hard day's labor and you're hungry and you're tired and you feel like you've done something productive. And the feeling of doing something productive is more important than actually being productive. And that's how she survives to some degree, is doing that. And maybe he sends her to do that for that reason. So his motivations are, so that's interesting though that you note that. So Ignatich then, why does he do, like he clearly is drawn to her and he admires her to some degree, but there's also a little different, but he tries to manage her a little bit, and he's not very good at it because she's unmanageable. But yeah, what is with that? I don't know. So that next phrase here. Why beat about the bush, said Matryona angrily to someone invisible. Since there have been no more horses, what you can't have around yourself, you haven't got. My back never heals up. Winter, you're pulling sledges. Summer, it's bundles on your back. It's God's truth, I'm telling you. The women went more than once in a day. On good days, Matryona brought 6 sacks home. She piled my peat up where it could be seen, and hid her own under the passageway, boarding up the hole every night. Now that is also interesting. What's going on with that? So she put his stolen peat in full view, and she hid hers away. What's with that?
His isn't stolen. His is a lot.
Oh, you're right. Because he's got the pension. You're correct. Okay, so she's just being clever. Not that you could distinguish the peat, but she does distinguish it. So that's one of those self-aware, this is stolen stuff and that's not stolen, so let me put that there and this here. Yes?
She's reminding me a lot of when you see in literature the characters that are really greedy and will hide their things. But it's funny because she's the absolute opposite of that. Like, those characters would be like self-denying and they want to be like having all their money and not spending it.
Yeah.
But she doesn't seem to have that as her goal. She's doing all the same things that those characters.
She has the resemblance of a thief, but not the character of one. It's really odd. So, and in a way, that is also an indictment of the regime, is it pushes even good characters to do bad things without the bad motives that would go with it. So nobody can be virtuous in this. Like, genuinely do the right thing for the right reason. And that's the intended effect of this. And again, this is a realistic novel, and its portrait, it follows 19th century Russian realism. And he's describing things that he would have seen, and is very good at picking apart character motivations as well with those little observations like we just made. If they don't just happen to think of it, the devils will never find it in their born days, said Matryona, smiling and wiping the sweat from her brow as she hides away her own stolen peat. What could the Peat Trust do? Its establishment didn't run to a watchman for every bog. I suppose they had to show a rich haul in their returns and then write off so much for crumbling, so much washed away by the rain. Sometimes they would take it into their heads to put out patrols and try to catch the women as they came into the village. The women would drop their catch, would drop their sacks and scatter. Or somebody would inform and there would be a house-to-house search. They would draw up a report on the stolen peat and threaten a court action. The women would stop fetching it for a while, but the approach of winter drove them out with sledges in the middle of the night. So that, again, there's this, it's like Keystone Cops. You get the bureaucracy trying to stop it, going through the gestures of doing it, but the women frightened of the being caught, at the same time being forced to do it. They're forced into it. And so once again, the difference between public morality and private morality starts to open up. And that's also one thing that I think that also is interesting in this era, is that people in a era where public morality is being reinforced and insisted upon, where there's no freedom, private morality acts at total odds with it, and necessarily does so. And we are with the private morality, but at this point, what we call all of these things, there would be an absolute congruity between public action and private action here. It's reinforced in the Odyssey, right? What the swineherd, Eumaeus, does is regarded by the narrator, Homer, as good. He praises him. He says, "My swineherd, you are the wonderful character." So the public and private conduct throughout it. So there's a harmony there. Private conduct and public conduct are uniform. Same thing here in Virgil's Aeneid, and same thing in the court. And that's why Gawain is so humiliated, because he fears for his life. And the nick in his neck is the mark of it, and he wears the green sash, which shows that he broke. His private conduct was not in keeping with his public confession. But by this point, we now have people with a public morality and a private morality that have totally diverged. So it's unnatural. There's something unnatural about the domination of nature under the bureaucracy of the Soviets. And eventually it turns against human nature itself, which we're seeing in our own day. So what will be called moral conduct, the state will tell you what that is. The state will tell you what human rights are. The state will tell you what human nature is. The state will teach you how to be polite. Political correctness. This is how you should be polite. Is it genuinely polite? Because no, Eumaeus does it out of the goodness of his heart. Is political correctness done out of the goodness of people's hearts, or is it something that's been top-down enforced, and which you can't even understand? Whereas this is all comprehensible. And again, individuals will do it, good individuals will do it out of the goodness of their heart, and it will fit that. So this is the extent of the portrait, and I think it's quite searching and quite telling. Any comments or further questions on this? We only have a couple minutes left here. Any aspects of the novella that you want us to explore before we close? I already went to the end of it last time, so yes.
What exactly happened with the whole train? She was like crushed in this train.
Yes?
Does that have anything to do with at the beginning when we're talking about how the trains are broken? Like, what is the train?
I think there was I think she was killed there because an official hadn't done his job. So there's complicity on the train driver's part. I think the train driver was he drunk? Can't even remember now.
They were saying that there's no light.
There was no light.
They couldn't see.
So they couldn't see that the truck,
truck,
right.
Yeah.
And so they went off the rails, derailed the train. Why was there no light? There was supposed to be light. Right, but somebody hadn't done their job to do the light, which caused the person who's driving the train not to see the light, caused the train to derail, ended up killing a woman who was at a place where the rail had ended, and they should have known better. So it's just one of these ridiculous, it's a ridiculous accident. It's not an accident. Accidents are things that we think happen, just happen. This is worse than just happened. It was, I wouldn't say it contrived, but it was caused by the total uselessness of the state and the personal corruption of individuals. The combination of those two things, and they ended up killing the best person in the novella. And when in the end, we come up with this character of Fadi, who had loved Matryona, and when she married his brother, ended up her undying enemy, literally taking her home apart, eating her out of house and home. He didn't even come to the wake. Such was his contempt. Although it says perhaps because he was holding a wake for his son. But it says twice in the next few days he walked angrily into the house for discussions with Matryona's sisters and the deserting cobbler. What was the argument about the house? In the end, that was all that was left. Everyone wanted the house and the home. And the home is what they desired, this home, which was her habitation, but also her place of her little Eden in the midst of a wilderness. And they wanted it, and they wanted a piece of it, and he wanted a piece of that. And he wanted to kill her, really. In the end, he did. Yes?
What about the second Matryona?
The second Matryona. What about her?
Why is she there?
I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah. So he marries somebody that's a lot like her, right? And it's almost, yeah, so that's really odd. So he has this weird relation, like he really loves Matryona, but not the real Matryona. I love the one that looks like her, except she's not very likable, unlike the original one.
But he beats her.
Sorry?
But he beats her.
Oh yeah, that doesn't matter. That just goes on.
It's just, I mean, he doesn't really like her. He just wants to
Yeah, but
get
she,
back at her somehow by
yeah,
learn something.
yeah. So the motivations are totally sick and vindictive. So he marries this woman because she reminds him of the original Matryona, but he doesn't love her. He does love the original one, and he doesn't love either of them in the end. Doesn't love the second one because she's not the first one, and doesn't love the first one because she rejected him the first time. So it's all purely vindictive, nasty, spiteful motivations, which anybody who's going on to be a lawyer in family court will know goes on all the time. People do terrible things to one another. And this is why, again, Jordan Peterson has talked about Solzhenitsyn and found him such a profound novelist as an explorer of the depravity of the human heart, which I think he is as well. And I'm finding it very intriguing how popular he's becoming precisely because he's talking about something that everybody ought to recognize, but has stopped talking about. Anyway, we're done with the course. So.